Hello and welcome to Audiobook Reviews. This review will be on a Discworld novel, Guards by Terry Pratchett. Now, I want to start this out by commenting that this is kind of the first Discworld novel I've read. I did some time ago start with The Color of Magic, and despite the fact that I do really enjoy Terry Pratchett's writing style, I just could not get into the book. It seemed like there was too much trying to be all thrown in to kind of set up the world, and it just something about it did not resonate with me. And so, even though I had a few other Discworld novels in my bookshelf, I didn't end up reading any of them else because I just couldn't get into The Color of Magic. Now, I've heard many people say that you should never start with The Color of Magic. Mostly I heard this after I started with The Color of Magic. So, after recently reading Good Omens and just wanting more of that Terry Pratchett style writing, I decided to jump back in and give a read to Guards. Now, this book, I think, did a lot better and did what I think The Color of Magic really needed, and that was having a very self-contained story. The story takes place in generally, for the most part, Ankh-Morpork. We have Carrot who comes from far away to go there. But the story takes place there, and throughout the story, we find out a lot about the city, how things work, but all as a part of the self-contained story instead of kind of sprawling out too much and going off into a million different ways, avenues, cutaway scenes, and really does a nice job. Guards specifically is meant as kind of a parody of the guards or the henchmen, the cronies in general that you see in all kinds of books and movies, and really kind of the action movie style thing where you have the hero and the guards all fight one by one and are cut down, and it's very clear that that is a big part of the parody. But even more than that, the book manages to fit in just about every trope and turn it on its head and make jokes about it. There's lots of general classic tropes that are brought up and just they're stated almost as a fact, like, oh, of course that's going to happen. Before I get into the spoiler section, one I think that I can say without spoiling anything is there's a pretty solid running joke about a 1 in a million chance because everybody knows a 1 in a million chance when you're that desperate, well, it just might work. And there's lots of jokes about that, even trying to make sure the odds are just right so that it is truly a 1 in a million chance for some things later on in the series. But there's lots of those different kind of just trope sayings, and so much of that turned on its head for the story that works really well. Of course, it's Terry Pratchett, so you know you're going to have a very unique writing style. At parts, it's almost like Douglas Adams meets Monty Python, but all falling into Pratchett's own very unique style. There's constant jokes and wordplay, and it's very intelligently written. And there's something about the way Pratchett so intelligently writes really dumb characters. It does take some getting used to, and I commented this when I reviewed Good Omens, reading in the way that people actually talk. There's a lot of misspelled words very intentionally, showing that that's how the characters are either pronouncing them or how they would spell them. There's a lot of just kind of colloquialisms that either maybe do fit our world or don't, and there's a lot of kind of these weird dialects that you get in. It's not as hard to read as some parts of Good Omens were, despite that being a fantastic novel, but there's a lot of that going on that really just makes you feel very quickly like you know the characters, especially. The story in general follows Carrot, who is a dwarf, quote unquote, but was actually finds out, not realizing that he's 6'6" and huge, that he was actually adopted by dwarves because they found him and took him in. So he decides it's time to kind of move on, and he is sent with a letter of recommendation to join the City Watch of Ankh-Morpork. Now, if you have read Discworld, you'll be very familiar with the kind of premise for Ankh-Morpork. If you haven't, it is this massive city, and it's a very unique city, but it is run by a patrician, Lord Vetinari, and a couple of the big things are crime is actually legal. There's a thieves guild, an assassins guild, etc. There's lots of different types of people and priests of strange gods or beings. Just a huge, huge mess. And obviously, with so many different novels, I know a lot of them do take place just in Ankh-Morpork. There is a lot going on. And like I said, the story does tell you a lot about it, how the different guilds work. You get a little bits of history here and there, how the city is actually run, even a little bit about foreign relations, all through the self-contained story, which is really, really well done. But Carrot goes to join the Watch, and you find out the Watch is actually three men: Captain Vimes, Sergeant Colin, and Corporal Nobbs, or Nobby, as we hear from. They essentially have no responsibilities other than just walking around at night and yelling, ringing a bell and yelling, it's 12 o'clock and all is well. And that's what they do. With crime being legal, there's not really law for them to follow. And they're just kind of this rundown ragtag group. But Carrot, he thinks of them as this romanticized organization he hears about from the man who brings him there, whose great great grandfather was a watchman back in the day when they were really important, all these special things. He's excited and he's given this antique book of the law and immediately starts trying to enforce it. So, a really big recurring joke and fun thing is you get Carrot, who is constantly quoting out these obscure laws and trying to arrest people even when it's people who really shouldn't be arrested. You have Captain Vimes, who is basically just a drunk and doesn't really have any sort of ambition. And you have Sergeant Colin and Corporal Nobbs, who just don't really even know what to do with Carrot there, trying to do what he thinks is his job. So a lot of antics come from there. The second plot is a mysterious character is trying to summon a dragon in order to have a hero be set up to kill the dragon, take over as king, and put him and his followers in charge. So we have these two plots that are going side by side and do end up intersecting quite a lot much later, but I won't get into spoilers just quite yet. Already, if you can't tell, it's a pretty zany plot, and Pratchett does always live in the absurd. He is the absurdist fantasy author. That's who Pratchett is. And even though I haven't read a huge amount of Pratchett, I'm familiar with some of his stories. I've seen so many bits and pieces over the years. It's just you feel immediately this unique storytelling approach, and there's nothing quite like it. I commented, I joked, it's like Douglas Adams meets Monty Python at parts, but it's also completely different at others, and it is a really interesting way to read a book. It's not often you find yourself reading a book where you just almost can't believe what you're reading, or there's just this terrible joke in there, and it's definitely a style of humor that fits with me. Now, not everybody may like that kind of absurd humor. There's definitely a huge grounding in British dry style humor as well. Obviously, Pratchett is British, so that makes sense. But his absurdist approach takes it so much further as well with what he does. Now, one thing I do want to comment a little bit more on the negative side with the book is the pacing. The pacing in the first about half of the book makes you feel like you're leading up almost to the end. Granted, it would have been a kind of stereotypical end right about halfway through, and then there's kind of a hard stop. Now, I will say, from reading it, it does seem like that was kind of the point. Pratchett was leading you to think the stereotypical thing was going to happen, and then something completely different happens, and the book kind of almost starts back up. It starts with a slow pace and then builds back up until the actual ending. Even with that being a bit intentional, it's one of the things where it's maybe just because of Pratchett's quirks, and I do like the writing style, but it's kind of a weird thing to have in the middle in a book where you feel like you're leading up to something, nothing really happens. It's naturally anticlimactic, and it took me out of the story for a short while. And I did get back in and did thoroughly enjoy the book overall, but it's just something that is a little bit off. And so I feel like I should mention here. Now, the second negative thing about the book, and this also seems to just be a Pratchett quirk, is there are no chapters. And I have to say, that drove me a little bit crazy. I tend to, decide how much I'm going to read by chapters. If it's a book with shorter chapters, I might read a few chapters and be done. If it's a book with longer chapters, then maybe I'll just do a chapter depending on how much time. So it's just kind of odd when you're reading and there are no chapters. It switches viewpoints regularly so you can read to the end of a viewpoint, but I just feel like I like that structure of chapters. And maybe it plays into the whole fact that everything's crazy in the world of Discworld, but it just was something that annoyed me a little bit. It was a little ironic because the last book I read, Lord Val's Bane by Stephen Donaldson, had extremely long chapters, so I found myself with that book occasionally stopping mid-chapter because I didn't have time to get through a whole one, but then I go to a book with no chapters. So definitely extremes, not something I was a huge fan of, but there it is in general. So at this point, I am going to talk a little bit more in detail. I'm not going to give huge spoilers, but I want to talk a little bit more deeply about the characters, their arcs throughout, and what generally happens with the first ending in the middle of the book and the real ending at the end of the book. So if you don't want to hear the spoilers, check the description and I will post the timestamp of where you can skip forward to the end of the video once the spoiler section is complete. Now, moving on to the section, I do want to comment that the characters are definitely a really fun way of exploring the world. Now, Carrot, and there is some trope there with him coming in, not really understanding how this city works. He lived in the mountains with dwarves. He takes things pretty literally, which is a recurring plot, and there are several jokes that rely on that. And has this romanticized view of the law, and he's trying to arrest people all the time, quoting different things, and it is a lot of really great humor. The character is, I feel like, intentionally left a little bit more two-dimensional than the rest of the characters because of that piece, but you do slowly see him growing, understanding things a little bit more. And something that I did actually think was very fun is you get to read letters that he's writing back to his mother and father, the dwarves, throughout the series, him telling things as they happen from his point of view, and just the way he talks and slowly comes to understand things. Him being so two-dimensional at first allows for bigger growth even with subtle changes later on, which was nice. But reading his letters as well was a really fun thing to happen. You have Captain Vimes, I commented, who's kind of a drunk and just feels like he's in a rut and really wants to matter, but is just kind of stuck with the Night Watch really not being important at all. And his arc, getting to see him actually kind of sober up, literally, because he's a drunk, and start actually investigating what's happening with the dragon, it was really fun to see. And there were a few tropes in there as well with the way he investigates, which were put in quite well. One of my favorites was at the end. Well, actually, the first end, so the middle of the book, where he figures out that it was Wance, who is somebody who serves under Lord Vetinari. He's the one who's actually been trying to summon the dragon and set up a king and basically take over the city. He figures this out and he goes to confront him and has kind of this just classic tropey standoff of the detective or the hero figures out everything and explains that they know, and then you have Wants who calls for his guards, and they come in and they don't want to actually apprehend Vimes because he's just one man and he's not armed. So they're expecting, of course, it's going to be the classic unarmed hero takes on just all these tens or hundreds of different guards, and so they think he's going to start jumping around like crazy, flying off chandeliers, grabbing a sword off the wall and fighting, and they don't want to apprehend him because of that. And it was one of the really, really fun parody moments of the story at that point. And they end up finally taking him, and he realizes he actually hadn't actually thought about what happens after you confront and have your monologue type piece. But at that moment, he does decide he is going to actually try to make a difference once he later escapes from the dungeon. You have Sergeant Colin and Corporal Nobbs, and they both are some interesting characters as well. You learn a lot more about them. Sergeant Colin, apparently, actually, in his youth, he's older and very out of shape, was really good at archery. He's actually married. There's a joke that him and his wife have been together so long because they never see each other because he works nights and she works days and they leave each other notes, but you get to learn a bit more about him and his past. And then Nabi is the character who is basically the most like ruffian type character, but it gets along with everybody. And there's definitely some fun there with him as well. Seeing them all kind of bumble along, none of them really wanting to do anything at first. There's even comment that the guards, and it recurs later with the palace guards, when they chase somebody, they always make sure to run slow enough so that they don't actually catch them, because it's when you catch people, that's when things get bad. And it's this whole idea that the guards are aware of the trope about them going and being all fought off, and whether it's good or bad, they're aware of this trope. And like I commented earlier in the video, there's a ton of tropes that they all do seem to be aware of. There's the whole idea in general that Wants has for summoning the dragon is, well, of course, you summon a dragon and then a hero has to come and slay it and then become king. That's just the way it works. Nevertheless, that he's the one who set up somebody to act as the king, who was the lost heir to the throne, who'd had a sword passed down. He sets up this whole narrative. Everyone just kind of goes along with it. And then the dragon, though, manages to find its way back into the world, kills the brand new so-called king. Um, no longer is being controlled by Wants, who I actually don't think I mentioned that he summoned the dragon and then his mind was controlling it before, but now it's found its way back on its own. And then they decide to actually crown the Dragon King. And this was the middle where it just kind of started over. They played it off like it was going to be this huge heroic thing that was going to happen. And it was no, they're all scared. They give the dragon the crown. The dragon decides it's king now. And it led to some really fantastic but frustrating moments because even though this is an older book, the political commentary is definitely present. It's the people basically decide, oh, it could be worse, or, it's it's the worst things it could be than having a dragon be your king, it'll help foreign policy. And they just kind of all go along with it. And even the dragon at one point, when it's conversing with I'm sorry, not Knobs, with Wants, when it's conversing with Wants, the dragon even literally learns about all the terrible things humans have done and is kind of just appalled because, dragons, eat people, breathe fire, but they don't torture each other and start all these wars with each other. And it's that little bit of even the dragon being appalled, but then everybody just going along with it and be like, oh, it's okay. The dragon's the king now. It's just the way it is. And being completely willing to go along with this terrible leader because they just do. And that's just kind of people. They'll deal with anything. And it does end up having to be the Watch coming together and deciding that they are going to try to save the day and be heroic. And you do get an amazing scene at the end, which I've been waiting for so long, where Carrot arrests the dragon after it's stunned and kind of taken down by Errol, who had a different name before, which was long, and I haven't really mentioned that part yet. But taken down by the small swamp dragon, and then Carrot wrestling the dragon was just something that was really great. I didn't mention specifically Lady Ramkin, who raised dragons, and she was an important part of the story as well. She raised dragons, and it was one of them who ended up helping. And you do get the absurd end where the big gigantic dragon was a female and one of the swamp dragons who was a male. They end up going off together, and it just never disappoints with making it seem like you're going to get some trope happening and not doing that trope. You find out at the end too, which is what you thought was going to happen the whole time. Carrot had a sword passed down to him. He has a birthmark in the shape of a crown, and he had recently come from afar and everything. And it's set up as he actually was the heir to the throne, probably. We don't know who came back, and that was all something that could have happened. And just another joke in there with he doesn't seem to realize whatsoever, but it really was a lot of fun. This book, like I said, manages to fit in so many tropes, parody so many things, and still give you an ending that is very, very different than what you would expect. It turns so many pieces on their heads and really has nonstop jokes throughout. Like I said, the fact that there are no chapters and the kind of false stop at the in the middle of the book. Both are a little bit jarring, but overall it was a really enjoyable book. If you like the kind of zany, absurdist type humor, if you like Pratchett in general, or other, I commented, Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Monty Python, just kind of absurd comedy, you will enjoy this book. It's really well written. It doesn't run into the problems that The Color of Magic did, in my opinion, and it definitely makes me excited to read some more of the Discworld novels. I have a couple of others, and I immediately, after finishing this book, ordered a couple of more. So if you enjoyed this review, feel free to subscribe. There will definitely be some more Terry Pratchett. I'm thinking about kind of peppering them in through other books as well, since most of them aren't particularly long and are pretty quick to get through. That said, that is my review of Guards. Like I said, if you enjoyed, feel free to subscribe. You can check out my other reviews, and I will be posting more every Friday and sometimes Wednesday for shorter videos.